Florida Republicans are pushing a new bill that would literally make their roads radioactive. Now, the Republican-controlled Florida Senate has approved a bill that would authorize the state's Department of Transportation to use phosphogypsum in road construction aggregate material. So basically, they're going to be able to make their roads out of phosphogypsum. What is that? Well, it is the waste left behind from mining phosphate rock, used for producing fertilizer, and is known for containing radioactive materials. Far more radioactive than the surrounding area, obviously. Phosphate rock contains small amounts of uranium and radium, according to the EPA, and in the leftover waste, those elements decay to radium, which then becomes radon, a potentially cancer-causing radioactive gas. That is what apparently Republicans in Florida want to make your roads out of. Wonderful. Literal radon gas on the roads. Congratulations, Florida. This is literally the most Florida story I've ever seen. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? Now, the EPA says on its website that because the wastes are concentrated, phosphogypsum is more radioactive than the original phosphate rock. The Clean Air regulations require that phosphogypsum, because of this radioactivity, be managed in engineered stacks to limit public exposure from emissions of radon and other radionuclides in the material. So that's what the Clean Air Act says. But don't worry, Republicans are, way ahead of you in trying to gut the Clean Air Act. And then they could finally move on with solving their phosphogypsum stack problem that they have in Florida. So again, a lot of the mining here that creates this phosphogypsum is done in just very few states, southern states, including Florida. A lot of this, again, is basically done in order to make fertilizer. So obviously fertilizer is massively in demand. It's a very important part of our food supply. And so they're doing this, and it's a huge industry, and this waste has to go somewhere. These stacks, I mean, they don't know what to do with them. And so now Republicans are saying, why don't we just make them into roads? No, that's not a good idea. That's actually a really bad idea. Now, let me show you an example of how this can turn out to be very bad. See, as I mentioned before, these large piles of phosphogypsum are put into stacks. One stack in Florida, known as Piney Point, was at the center of some controversy after a near catastrophic breach that ended up with millions of gallons of radioactive wastewater being dumped into local waterways. Yeah, now you're not going to be surprised that part of the reason this happened is the state of Florida wanted to save money. And the state of Florida decided to, allow privatization to come in. Great. According to the Tampa Bay Times, back in the early 2000s, the Army Corps of Engineers was against any plans to try to allow for the dredging of Piney Point. So this was, again, a former phosphate plant site. They wanted to dredge into a new ship berth. So you had some private financiers come in and buy up the site so that they could make some money by dredging it. Now, the Port Authority, made up of Manatee County commissioners, approached the Florida Department of Environmental Protection about the idea back in 2005. The state spent years before trying to drain the acidic wastewater from Piney Point's radioactive phosphogypsum stacks and replacing the ponds with plastic-lined reservoirs. This plastic apparently did not last. Post records show that department officials and a consultant engineer, Ardeman and Associates, met with the Port Authority's governing board back in October of 2005. They touted the strength and longevity of this plastic liner, saying it was a material that would survive the elements well past our lifetimes, and unfortunately, that happened to not be true. In fact, since these ponds were lined with this plastic, we've had 2 disastrous tears. Oops. So now, getting back to the private investment vulture capital firm named HRK. They bought it afterwards. After all this disaster, they ended up eventually going bankrupt. But at first they thought, hey, we can make money. Millions of dollars. Do you even know how to deal with a phosphogypsum stack? No, don't really care. Don't care. We're gonna make money. It's money. It's all about the monies. Now, they have no experience managing a phosphogypsum radioactive site. How did they get this in the first place? How did they get approval? It's because they had lobbyists. And they had allies at the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And of course, lobbying from their consultants at Arteman and Associates. It must be the associates, the ones with all the money. Now, they were able to get to they were able to acquire the site over objections from the Army Corps of Engineers, who had wrote to the executive director of the port back in 2009, saying that even if the risk of failure was low due to that plastic lining, the consequences could be great. And not great as in good, but very, very bad. So, as I mentioned, though, they had 1 tear in the liner, and then another less than a decade later. So, pretty disastrous with all this wastewater that is radioactive getting into the soil. And yeah, it's not good. Not good at all. So, as I mentioned before, this has impacts on the environment and on human beings. Obviously, it's radiation. Since it's radiation, you have increased risks of cancer. And of course, we also know that phosphorus in general has a pretty negative impact on people's, for example, their respiratory system and other extremely negative detrimental effects. And then, of course, you combine that with radon, radiation, and yeah, it's just not good at all. In fact, radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer and is linked to about 21,000 lung cancer deaths every year in the United States, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. The agency also says it's the single greatest environmental source of radiation exposure, and it's going to be all on Florida's roadways. Phosphorus also causes giant algae blooms, correct. And that, of course, ruins local ecology in the wetlands. And so, not good at all. But hey, this might be signed into law by Ron DeSantis. That's literally the last stop. If signed, the Department of Transportation would be permitted to undertake demonstration projects using the material. I wouldn't want to volunteer for that. To determine its feasibility as a paving material, the department would be required to conduct a study on its suitability for that material, which must be completed by April 1st, 2024. If signed, phosphogypsum would join a list of other recyclable materials in the bill that legislators say contribute to problems of declining space in landfills and could be used for road construction. The thing about phosphogypsum is it doesn't go into landfills. It goes into special stacks, as I've explained several times before. Other materials already approved to be in the roads are tire rubber, ash residue from coal combustion byproducts, mixed plastic, construction steel, and glass. The bill does not state that any phosphogypsum-centered plans for road construction will be used in accordance, it does state, in accordance with the conditions of the EPA's approval, which the EPA spokesperson reiterated to CBS News. Quote, any request for a specific use of phosphogypsum in roads will need to be submitted to EPA, as EPA's approval is legally required before the material can be used in road construction. Upon issuing any notice of pending approval, EPA will open a public comment period, make any applications, and our technical analysis of those applications publicly available, and seek input on proposed decisions. So, but here's the thing. The Florida Department of Environment already was like, no, go ahead and use, go ahead and mess with this phosphogypsum. Don't worry about it. Just dredge the area. It'll be fine. Do you really see the US EPA doing any better? Do you really see in this corrupted, corporate establishment, the EPA not bowing to corporate interests, especially since, as we've seen before, companies coming in, private investors coming in, and trying to take ownership in order to make some money? I don't see anything good happening from this. In fact, I see a lot of terrible things happening as a result of this. But again, I'm not surprised to see, Florida championing terrible. Now, Regan Whitlock, a staff attorney for the Center of Biological Diversity, told CBS News that when it comes to, again, phosphogypsum, this particular waste, there's really no good options to get rid of it. And that's another thing that we should have a discussion on. He said there's not really a safe way to dispose of the radioactive materials that exists other than gyp stack storage. And the industry is only continuing to make more. Now, are there alternatives to phosphogypsum? Yes. This is mainly mined from rocks. There are other ways that you can get phosphorus in order to make fertilizer. It would, of course, require a change. It would require regulation of the industry itself so that they do not get it from these radioactive sources. You can get it, for example, from animal manure. That's another way that you can get phosphorus in order to use it in fertilizer. But right now, again, there's really no plans from the EPA to put more regulations on this. In fact, if DeSantis does this, it's probably going to lead to less regulations. And if a Republican wins in 2024, you see even less regulation on this, especially if it's Ron DeSantis, who would immediately try to dismantle the EPA. A lot of the Republicans have said that they wanted to get rid of the EPA. And so if they do, well, then watch out if you're in Florida. Welcome to radioactive roads. Waste compost is another source. Yes, there are other alternative sources than this, but as I said before, the business model, there's already $1 billion industry around phosphogypsum mining and the creation of these stacks. So as long as that incentive, that monetary incentive is there, it's not going to change.